After I paid $80,000 for my son's wedding, he thanked someone else as his biological mother. My name is Margaret Hayes. I never thought a mother could be erased from her own child's story with just a few words. But that day, my son did exactly that. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I had always believed that a mother's sacrifices were invisible threads woven through her child's life, unspoken but unbreakable. The meals I skipped to pay for my son Daniel's schooling, the overtime shifts I worked to cover his college tuition, the quiet dreams I shelved so he could chase his own, all of it, I thought would come together one day as proof of a bond no one could deny. So when Daniel told me he was getting married, my heart overflowed with joy. A mother's dream, right? To see her son step into his new life, hand in hand with the woman he chose. I wanted everything to be perfect. Not just for him, but for her too. After all, if she was becoming part of our family, then she deserved to feel welcomed. But weddings, as I quickly learned, are hungry beasts. Every detail carried a price tag that gnawed at my savings. The venue deposit alone was more than my yearly pension. The catering 12 courses, not a simple buffet, was chosen by my daughter-in-law's family, but guess who signed the checks? Me. I told myself it was fine. I told myself this was what love looked like. Selflessness, generosity, putting your child first, even when your bank account groaned under the weight. $80,000. That's what it came to in the end. 80,000, the entirety of my retirement nest egg, the cushion I had built brick by brick through decades of teaching English to restless teenagers. I drained it with a trembling hand, but a smile on my lips whispering, "This is for Daniel. This is for love." I didn't brag about it. I didn't complain. I didn't even let Daniel know the true extent of the sacrifice. Because a mother doesn't buy love, she gives it freely, quietly, like air. But I noticed the first cracks early on. My daughter-in-law, Emily, seemed distant. She never called me Mom. Not even Mrs. Hayes. Just Margaret, clipped and cold, as if saying my name tasted bitter. During planning meetings, she often exchanged glances with her aunt, a woman named Lorraine, wealthy, polished, always dripping with pearls and superiority. Lorraine had money, old money, and Emily flaunted that connection like it was her crown. Still, I swallowed my discomfort. I told myself Emily would warm up to me. I told myself Daniel's choice of a bride must mean she had qualities I couldn't yet see. On the night before the wedding, I stayed up late sewing a small charm into the hem of Daniel's suit jacket, a tradition my own mother had taught me. For protection, she used to say. I whispered a prayer as I stitched, "May this marriage be strong, may this family grow in love, may he always know his mother's devotion." The next morning, as I dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. A 56-year-old woman with auburn-streaked gray hair, faint lines around her eyes, and a heart too full of hope. I pinned on my modest brooch, something borrowed, something old, and smiled through nerves. The ceremony was breathtaking. White roses lined the aisle, chandeliers glimmered like constellations, and the music swelled in a way that made every heart beat a little faster. I sat in the front row, hands clasped tight, watching my son in his tailored suit, waiting for the moment when all my sacrifices would crystallize into something tangible. His gratitude, his acknowledgement, his love. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I clapped until my palms stung. My eyes blurred with tears as Daniel kissed his bride. At the reception, laughter filled the air. Glasses clinked, music played, and the smell of roast lamb and wine wafted through the hall. It was during the speeches that my moment finally came. The microphone passed from best man to maid of honor, then into Daniel's hand. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment every mother dreams of. He would thank me, his mother, for the life I had given him, the wedding I had sacrificed everything to create. But instead, he smiled at the crowd, his voice ringing clear. I want to thank the woman who has been like a mother to me, no more than that, my real mother, Lorraine. Laughter and applause rippled through the room as his arms stretched toward her. Lorraine rose gracefully, beaming, while I sat frozen in my seat. My heart stopped. My son had just erased me in front of everyone. The applause thundered. I sat in silence, my hands trembling in my lap, the taste of iron in my mouth. $80,000, a lifetime of love. And with one sentence, he had called another woman his biological mother. I didn't stand. I didn't cry. I simply sat there as if turned to stone, while the woman who had contributed nothing to his life basked in the recognition that should have been mine. And in that moment, I realized something: bitter money can buy a wedding, but it cannot buy respect. The months leading up to that day had already taken pieces of me I didn't realize I could give away. Weddings are supposed to bring families together, aren't they? That's what I believed. But from the first moment Emily's family stepped into the planning, it became clear that I was not a partner in this event. I was a bank account. I still remember sitting at that long mahogany table in the wedding planner's office. Emily sat straight-backed, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the folder of glossy catalogs. Her Aunt Lorraine hovered beside her, pearls glinting against her black dress, her eyes skimming past me as if I were part of the wallpaper. Daniel. He smiled nervously, nodding to every demand his fiancée made, never once meeting my eyes to ask, "What do you think, Mom?" The planner laid out options: florals, photographers, menu packages. Each time the deluxe choice was presented, Emily leaned in and said, "We'll take that one." She never glanced at me, never asked if it was possible, never wondered who was footing the bill. When the planner announced the price for the venue alone, a sum larger than my yearly teacher's pension, my chest tightened. I hesitated, waiting for someone to acknowledge the absurdity. But Lorraine clapped her hands softly, murmuring, "Only the best for our family." Family. The word stung. I could have said no. I could have drawn a line right then and there. But I didn't. I watched my son beam at Emily, his eyes lit with a devotion that made me ache with both pride and jealousy. If this was what it took for him to be happy, then I would give it, even if it hollowed me out. So I wrote the checks, over and over. Each one carved another scar into my savings, into the retirement years I had imagined spending in peace. The wedding dress alone could have bought a car. Imported lace, hand-stitched beading. Emily twirled in front of the mirror, her eyes sparkling. Not once did she thank me. She looked at Lorraine instead, who nodded approvingly as though she had paid for it. I wanted to say, "That's my money. That's my gift. That's me standing behind you in that mirror." But the words stayed locked in my throat. There were nights I came home from meetings and sat at my kitchen table with the bills spread around me. My house was modest, my life frugal. I cooked simple meals, wore the same coat for 10 winters, never took vacations. And here I was dismantling everything I had carefully built for decades in exchange for one day of celebration. But when Daniel called me late one night, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thanks, Mom, you're making this the wedding of our dreams." My heart softened. It was enough. I thought it was enough. The rehearsal dinner was where I noticed it most. My side of the family sat quietly, unsure of their place in the grand show Emily's relatives were orchestrating. Lorraine floated around like the hostess of the century, giving orders, whispering into Emily's ear, her eyes occasionally flicking toward me with a smirk I couldn't quite decode. I wore a simple navy dress that night, one I'd owned for years, pressed neatly and accented with my mother's brooch. Emily's mother wore sequins, Lorraine draped herself in silk. And though I sat at the head table as Daniel's mother, it was Lorraine whom guests approached with compliments, Lorraine whose glass was clinked for toasts. Daniel sat between Emily and Lorraine, his chair angled away from me. I caught myself studying the way he leaned toward them like a boy seeking approval. It was subtle, maybe invisible to everyone else, but to me, it was a warning bell in the distance. Still, I silenced it. I told myself the day of the wedding would be different. The spotlight would return to its rightful place. My son would stand in front of everyone and acknowledge me, the mother who raised him, the mother who gave everything for him, the mother who paid for this entire spectacle. I wanted to believe that love could not be bought, not even by a woman like Lorraine. But in my heart, a seed of unease had already been planted. And when the wedding day finally arrived, it bloomed into something darker than I could have ever imagined. The morning of the wedding dawned golden, as though the world itself had conspired to make the day perfect. I stood by my window, coffee in hand, watching sunlight spill across my small garden. My roses swayed gently in the breeze, unaware that inside me nerves twisted like vines around my ribs. I had laid out my dress the night before, a deep emerald gown that flattered my aging figure without screaming for attention. I wanted to look elegant, dignified, but not overshadow the bride. After all, this was Daniel's day. His joy mattered more than my vanity. Still, as I brushed my hair, I caught my reflection in the mirror and whispered to myself, "This is your moment too. Don't forget that." By the time I arrived at the venue, the place was alive with motion. White roses lined the aisle and crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. The scent of lilies mingled with perfume, filling the air with something both intoxicating and suffocating. Guests in tailored suits and sequined gowns drifted through the space, laughter rising like champagne bubbles. I took my seat in the front row, pride swelling in my chest. Every detail, the music, the flowers, the menu, was the result of my sacrifices. My fingerprints were everywhere, even if no one else could see them. When Daniel appeared at the altar, my breath caught. He looked so handsome in his tailored suit, his posture confident, his smile wide. For a moment, it was as if he were a little boy again, dressed for his school recital, searching the crowd for my face. I imagined him catching my eye, giving me that small private smile he always saved for me. But instead, his gaze swept over me like I was part of the decor. His eyes settled on Emily as she entered, her white dress shimmering like starlight, her arm tucked proudly into Lorraine's. Not her father's, not her mother's, her aunt's. A murmur rippled through the guests at that sight, but no one dared question it. Lorraine basked in the attention, holding Emily's hand as though presenting her to the world. The ceremony unfolded in a blur of vows and blessings. I clapped until my palms ached when the officiant finally declared them husband and wife. My eyes stung with tears, not just of pride, but of relief. All the sacrifices, all the long nights had led to this moment, my son stepping into a future I had fought to give him. At the reception, the hall glowed with warmth. Glasses clinked, silverware scraped against china, and laughter filled the air. Waiters glided between tables with trays of wine, and the band struck up melodies that made even the most stoic relatives tap their feet. I sat surrounded by my siblings, who congratulated me in hushed voices. "You did well, Margaret. Everything is beautiful." Their words soothed me, but I wanted something more, something only my son could give. The speeches began. The best man cracked jokes, drawing laughter. The maid of honor dabbed her eyes as she spoke of Emily's loyalty and grace. My chest tightened with anticipation. Next would be Daniel. He stood adjusting his tie, the microphone catching his steady voice. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight." He began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Your presence means more to us than words can say." I leaned forward, heart hammering. This was it. "But most of all," he continued, "I want to thank the woman who has been like a mother to me, no more than that, my real biological mother, Lorraine." For a split second, the room went silent, as though time itself had frozen. Then thunderous applause erupted. Guests turned toward Lorraine, who pressed a hand to her chest in feigned surprise, her pearls catching the light as she smiled radiantly. My breath caught in my throat. My vision blurred. Did I hear him right? Biological mother. The words echoed inside me louder than the applause. My real mother. Not a mother. Not like a mother. His real mother. I sat there frozen, as though my body had turned to stone. My hands trembled in my lap. $80,000. Decades of sacrifice. And with one sentence, Daniel had erased me. I glanced around. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at me with pity, others looking away as though my humiliation were contagious. My sisters reached for my hand, but I pulled back, afraid their touch would shatter what little composure I had left. I wanted to scream, to stand and shout, "I am his mother. I carried him, raised him, sacrificed for him." Lorraine gave nothing but condescension, yet she takes my place. But my throat was locked. My lips would not part. Instead, I sat there quietly, my face frozen in what I hoped looked like a polite smile, while inside me, something cracked. The applause faded, the music swelled, and Daniel went on speaking his words a blur. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was that in front of everyone, my son had chosen another woman over me. As Lorraine accepted the praise, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, I stared at Daniel, searching his face for regret, for hesitation, for some flicker of acknowledgement that he had hurt me. There was none, only pride, only blindness. And in that moment, as my heart shattered quietly inside me, a question echoed through my mind. Have you ever been in a situation like this? If you were in this situation, would you forgive or take revenge? Comment below to let us know. The applause seemed to last forever, each clap striking against me like stones. My ears rang, my chest hollowed, and I sat there, trapped inside a body that felt suddenly foreign. I had imagined this moment so many times, my son thanking me, his voice breaking with emotion, perhaps even pulling me to my feet for a hug in front of everyone. Instead, the reality was cruel. I was invisible. Worse than invisible. I had been replaced. Daniel's words replayed in my head, each syllable a blade, my real biological mother. The hall glowed with golden light, the kind meant to flatter photographs. But to me, it felt suffocating. My hands clutched the folds of my emerald dress so tightly my knuckles turned white. Around me, people whispered, their voices sharp and thin as needles. She raised him, didn't she? Why would he say that? Maybe Lorraine... I shut it out. I couldn't bear it. Lorraine rose from her seat with deliberate grace, her silk gown shimmering, her pearl necklace catching the chandelier's glow. She accepted Daniel's words with a trembling hand, pressed dramatically against her chest, her face arranged in a picture of humility. "Oh, Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying perfectly across the hall. "You've made me the happiest woman alive." The crowd erupted again. Champagne glasses lifted, camera flashes sparked. I sat stone still. Inside, something broke. Not with the sharp violence of glass, but with the slow, agonizing tear of fabric. I remembered the night I stayed up sewing a lucky charm into Daniel's jacket hem. I remembered the mornings I packed lunches even when my own stomach ached with hunger because money was too tight for both of us. I remembered holding his fevered body through endless nights, whispering promises that he would never be alone. And here he was, erasing all of it with one sentence. My vision blurred, not from tears I couldn't cry, not yet, but from the dizzying realization that my son had chosen someone else to be his mother. The speeches continued. People laughed, clinked glasses, dabbed at their eyes. Daniel beamed at Emily, then at Lorraine, never once at me. When dinner was served, waiters placed plates of lamb and asparagus before us. I stared down at the food, unable to lift my fork. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a sick weight in my stomach. Lorraine leaned across the table, once her voice low but sharp enough for me to hear. "It's sweet, isn't it, Margaret? How Daniel appreciates the people who truly support him." My breath caught. Her smile was all teeth, her words a dagger cloaked in politeness. I wanted to lash out, to tell her she had no right, that support wasn't measured in money or social status but in years of sacrifice. But my tongue felt heavy, my throat thick. Instead, I looked at Daniel. My son. My boy. His face glowed with pride, with love for them, not for me. The music swelled again as the couple took to the dance floor for their first dance. Guests gathered around, clapping, cheering, their faces bright with joy. Lorraine hovered at the edge, dabbing at her eyes as though she had raised Daniel from the cradle herself. I stayed seated, and in that chair beneath the glittering chandeliers and the suffocating applause, I felt my world tilt. Everything I had believed, that love was unconditional, that sacrifice was seen, that motherhood was unshakable, crumbled. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it something darker stirred. A coldness, a whisper. If he had erased me so easily, then perhaps I needed to show him just how much of his life had been written in my hand. For now, I stayed silent. I smiled politely when others looked my way. I sipped water, though my throat was dry as dust. But inside, I made a quiet vow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When Daniel spoke those words, my real biological mother, I thought perhaps I had misheard, that maybe grief and exhaustion had twisted them inside my head. But no, he had said it with clarity, with pride, and the proof stood before me, Lorraine. Lorraine, the woman who had swept into our lives only recently, though it felt like she had always been lurking in the shadows waiting for her cue to enter the stage. I first met her a year before the wedding. Emily had introduced her casually during a dinner, calling her Aunt Lorraine, but there had been nothing casual about the way Lorraine carried herself. She was draped in wealth and power, in the kind of arrogance money breeds when it's old and unearned. Her hands glittered with rings, her perfume clung to the air long after she left, and her words always dripped with condescension. That night, I remember feeling out of place in my own home. Lorraine's gaze had swept across my modest living room, the worn but polished wooden furniture, the photos of Daniel through the years. His first toothless grin, his graduation cap tilted awkwardly, and she had smiled with her lips but not her eyes. Charming, she had said. So quaint. Emily had giggled. Daniel had smiled weakly. And I had sat there, my cheeks burning, though I didn't yet understand why. Now, watching her bask in the glow of Daniel's acknowledgement, it all clicked. Lorraine hadn't come into our lives to support Emily. She had come to take something from me. At the reception, when the dancing had subsided, I slipped out onto the terrace to breathe. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint hum of cicadas. My chest felt heavy, my throat raw, but I couldn't cry. Not yet. I heard laughter behind me and turned just enough to see them, Daniel, Emily, and Lorraine, clustered together like a family portrait. Lorraine's hand rested on Daniel's arm. Emily's head tilted against his shoulder, and my son smiled as though nothing were missing. As though I had never existed. It wasn't until weeks later, when the noise of the wedding had faded and the thank you notes began to trickle in, that I learned the truth. One of my cousins, who had always had a nose for gossip, stopped by with a bottle of wine. She hesitated at first, as though debating whether to tell me, but after a glass, she leaned in, her voice lowered. "Margaret, you know Lorraine's history, don't you?" I shook my head. She married into money. Her husband was a businessman, old and frail, and when he died, she inherited everything. Millions, Margaret. But more than that, she has no children of her own. No heirs. Do you see? The wine turned bitter on my tongue. She's been grooming Emily for years, treating her like the daughter she never had. And now, through Emily, she has Daniel too. That speech at the wedding that was orchestrated, I'd bet my life on it. She wants them to see her as a mother. She wants to buy their loyalty, their devotion. And Daniel, well, he's young. He's dazzled. I sat in silence, the words slicing through me. So that was it. It wasn't just about love. It was about money, status, the illusion of belonging to a family drenched in wealth and grandeur. My son had not only erased me, he had traded me. Weeks turned into months, and the distance between us widened. Daniel called less. When he did, his tone was brisk, hurried, filled with mentions of dinners at Lorraine's estate, vacations she had generously offered to fund investments she was advising him on. Emily, once cold but tolerable, now barely concealed her disdain. She didn't need me anymore. She had Lorraine. At first, I tried to fight it gently. I invited them over, cooked Daniel's favorite meals, asked about their lives. But each time they arrived late, left early, and sat at my table with distracted smiles, as though counting the minutes until they could return to Lorraine's world. One evening, as we cleared the dishes, I reached for Daniel's hand. "Do you remember," I asked softly, "when I used to stay up with you during storms, how you'd climb into my bed because the thunder scared you?" He smiled faintly but then shook his head. "Lorraine says I should let go of childish memories, Mom. They don't help me move forward." Lorraine says. I froze, my heart clenching. Those two words were becoming his gospel. The next blow came during a family gathering. My sisters and cousins had come over, and as always, conversation drifted to Daniel and his new life. Someone asked if he and Emily planned to buy a house. "Oh, Lorraine's helping with that?" Daniel said casually. "She's practically family. She's like, well, you all know. She's been more of a mother to me these past few years than anyone else." The words were a dagger. Right there in front of everyone, he diminished me again. My relatives glanced at me, their pity sharp as knives. I smiled brittle and forced my nails digging into my palms under the table. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the dark with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. My hands trembled as I sifted through old photographs. Daniel as a boy, Daniel with scraped knees, Daniel holding the trophy from his first spelling bee. All the proof of a life I had built of love that had been mine alone. But I realized then that Lorraine was rewriting history. She was planting herself into the story of my son's life, and he was letting her. The humiliation at the wedding had been public, but this slow erasure was worse. It was death by 1,000 cuts. And yet, as the grief gnawed at me, something else began to form in its shadow. Resolve. I could not undo the betrayal. I could not change Daniel's blindness. But I could reclaim myself. If Lorraine wanted to play the role of mother, let her feed him with money, let her coddle him with promises of wealth. But she would never own my sacrifices. She would never erase my truth. And one day Daniel would learn that a mother's love is not something you can replace with pearls and estates. I would make sure of it. After the wedding, life returned to its ordinary rhythm, or at least it seemed to for everyone else. For me, nothing was ordinary anymore. I would wake in the mornings and sit at the kitchen table with my cup of coffee, staring at the newspaper without reading a single word. My eyes would drift to the framed photographs on the wall, Daniel at 5 years old, beaming with a gap-toothed smile. Daniel in his cap and gown, his arms slung around my shoulder. I used to look at those photos with pride. Now they felt like silent witnesses to my erasure. There were days when I felt hollow, as though someone had scooped out my insides and left me a shell. The humiliation from that night replayed endlessly, not just the words Daniel spoke, but the applause that followed. That applause was the cruelest part, the sound of everyone validating my replacement. Yet strangely, the more I replayed it, the less I cried. In fact, tears stopped coming altogether. I had exhausted them. In their place came something quieter. A numbness, but not the kind that leads to despair, the kind that sharpens. I started moving through my days like a ghost, watching everything, storing every detail. When Daniel and Emily stopped by to check in, I studied them carefully. Emily, radiant in her new designer clothes, always dropped little remarks about Lorraine's generosity. The vacation home she had offered for them to use, the stock tips she had passed along, the expensive furniture she was helping them choose. Daniel nodded along his chest, puffed with a pride that wasn't his own. He no longer asked me how I was doing. He no longer lingered for coffee, no longer kissed my cheek with the warmth he once had. Our conversations were short, polite, rehearsed, as though he were speaking to an acquaintance rather than his mother. The strangest part was that I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't even confront him about that speech at the wedding. On the surface, I smiled, nodded, listened. But inside, something had shifted. It's hard to describe that feeling, the moment when grief hardens into steel. I suppose it's what soldiers feel when they've lost too much to mourn and instead start planning their counterattack. One evening, I sat alone at my desk, a small lamp casting a circle of light on the wooden surface. I pulled out a notebook, the kind I used to grade my students' essays in, and I began to write. Not letters, not stories, not pleas, but facts, dates, figures. The cost of Daniel's tuition, the number of times I'd driven him to sports practice, the loans I had repaid, the sacrifices I had made, the $80,000 for his wedding. Every detail went into that notebook, line after line, page after page. It was as though I were building an archive, a record no one could erase. And the more I wrote, the calmer I became. In the silence of my home, I could almost hear my mother's voice, the woman who had raised me alone after my father walked out. She used to say, "Margaret's strength isn't loud. It's the silence before the storm." That silence lived in me now. I began to notice things more clearly. At family gatherings, people's eyes flickered between me and Lorraine, their discomfort thinly veiled. My sisters whispered their disapproval when Daniel wasn't listening. Even my cousins who adored gossip seemed to tread carefully around me. I realized they all knew what had happened. They had seen it. They had heard it. My humiliation wasn't just mine, it was public, etched into memory. And yet I refused to let their pity define me. At night, lying awake in the quiet, I would whisper to myself, "This isn't the end. You're not done. They may think they've erased you, but you still hold the pen." It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about me, my dignity, my truth. The turning point came one afternoon when I passed by Lorraine's estate on my way to the market. Her mansion loomed behind iron gates, a monument to wealth and excess. And there, on the front lawn, stood Daniel helping her gardener move flower pots. Emily leaned against the porch rail, sipping lemonade, laughing at something Lorraine said. They looked like a picture-perfect family, but as I slowed my car and watched them through the gate, a strange calm washed over me. It no longer hurt the way it had at the wedding. Instead, it confirmed what I already knew. I had been written out of their story. And if they had chosen to erase me, then I had the freedom to erase them too. That night, I went back to my notebook. I opened a new page and wrote in careful script, "Legacy is not owed, it is chosen." I thought about my will, my savings, the modest home I had built with my own hands. For years, I had planned to leave everything to Daniel, believing that was what mothers do. But now I realized I had a choice. If he could call another woman his real mother, then perhaps he didn't need what his real mother had worked for. The eerie calm that filled me then was unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was power. And I promised myself that when the time came, I would wield it quietly, decisively. They would never see it coming. After the wedding, the ripple effects spread quickly like cracks spidering through glass. Family gatherings no longer felt like gatherings. They felt like crime scenes, with everyone circling the memory of what had happened, pretending not to see the evidence lying in plain sight. The first time I faced my extended family after that night was at my niece's birthday party. The living room buzzed with children's laughter, balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and the smell of frosted cake filled the air. Yet beneath the cheer there was a tension so sharp I could almost taste it. When I walked in, conversations faltered. Eyes darted my way, then quickly looked elsewhere. My sisters approached, their smiles too quick, their hugs too tight, as if trying to cover pity with affection. "You look wonderful, Margaret," one of them whispered. I knew what she meant. "You look strong considering." As the afternoon wore on, I noticed the whispers. Cousins gathered in corners, speaking in low voices, stealing glances at me. Once, when I entered the kitchen to pour a drink, the chatter stopped abruptly. The silence was louder than words. I caught fragments anyway. "Did you hear what he called Lorraine? Imagine." After all, Margaret did for him. Money changes people. Each phrase stabbed, but I kept my face composed. I smiled when spoken to, laughed when appropriate, played with the children, and pretended not to hear. Inside, though, I recorded everything. Every whisper was another stitch in the fabric of resolve I was weaving. When Daniel and Emily finally arrived late as usual, the air shifted. Daniel greeted relatives with practiced ease. Emily swept in with her designer handbag swinging at her side, and together they looked every bit the golden couple. But when Daniel hugged me, it was perfunctory quick, like a man greeting an old acquaintance rather than his mother. "Hi, Mom," he said, his eyes already scanning the room. I tried to hold on to him a little longer to anchor him, but he pulled away smoothly, oblivious. Throughout the party, I watched as relatives engaged them with careful curiosity. No one mentioned the wedding directly, but the silence around it was suffocating. My sisters, however, couldn't resist subtle jabs. So Daniel one asked lightly, "How's Lorraine? Must be nice having such devoted support." Daniel smiled, unbothered. "She's wonderful. She's been such a blessing. Honestly, I don't know where we'd be without her." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not just because he praised Lorraine, but because he said it so casually, so naturally, as though the role she played in his life was unquestionable. As though I hadn't existed. Emily chimed in, then her voice sugary sweet but her eyes sharp. "Lorraine's been helping us so much with our future. She has such wisdom, such maternal instincts." Maternal instincts. I excused myself to the bathroom before anyone could see the tremor in my hands. Behind the locked door, I gripped the sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but beneath that, I saw something new. Not weakness, not fragility, but something harder. A survivor. When I emerged, I noticed my cousins giving me sidelong glances, their expressions conflicted. Some pitied me, others seemed almost impressed by my composure. A few avoided me entirely, unwilling to step into the shadow of my humiliation. But it wasn't just my family. Word spread in the community, too. At the grocery store, a neighbor leaned across the aisle and whispered, "I heard what happened at the wedding." "I'm so sorry, Margaret." At church, whispers followed me like smoke. Even colleagues from my teaching days sent me hesitant notes of sympathy as if I had suffered a death. In a way, I had. I had lost the son I thought I knew. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed completely oblivious. He came by once or twice, usually with Emily in tow, but his visits were shallow, transactional. He'd talk about Lorraine's advice about investments she was guiding him toward, about the vacations she was planning for them. He never once brought up the wedding speech, never once acknowledged the wound he had carved into me. It was as if he had rewritten the script of his life, and I no longer had a role in it. One afternoon, as they were leaving my house, I walked them to the door. Daniel hugged me quickly, already distracted, while Emily smiled politely. Lorraine was waiting outside in her sleek car, her sunglasses reflecting the sun. "Thank you, Margaret," she called out as they climbed in. "You've done so much. Really, you should be proud." Her tone dripped with mockery, though her lips stretched into a perfect smile. I stood at the door, my hands clenched at my sides, watching as the car pulled away. And then something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't even humiliation. It was clarity. If Daniel wanted to choose Lorraine, let him. If Emily wanted to play the dutiful niece while sharpening her claws, let her. They thought they had erased me, but in truth, they had freed me, because I still had power. Not the power of applause or wealth or appearances, but the power of truth, of history, of choices yet to be made. That evening, I pulled out my notebook again. I flipped past the pages filled with figures and sacrifices and began a new section. Aftermath, I wrote at the top, and then beneath it I listed every encounter since the wedding. Every whisper, every conversation, every moment of erasure. I turned my pain into record, my humiliation into evidence. The more I wrote, the calmer I felt, because I knew now that this story wasn't finished. Not yet. The weeks after that family gathering stretched into a blur of silence, but not the suffocating kind anymore. It was a silence I carried deliberately like armor. Everyone expected me to fall apart, to weep endlessly, to shrink into a husk of myself. And in truth, there were nights when the ache of betrayal felt unbearable, when I curled into bed and pressed my hand against my chest, as if I could hold my heart together before it split in two. But then the mornings came, and with them the clarity that grief had carved into me. I rose, made my coffee, and sat with my notebook. That notebook had become my confessional, my ledger, my weapon. Page after page I wrote. Not poetry, not pleas, but facts. Hard, irrefutable facts. September 15th, 1994 paid Daniel's first tuition fee at St. Mary's Elementary, $40,300. July 3rd, 2001, worked 2 extra summer jobs to cover his soccer camp. May 12th, 2010, loan of $6,000 for his used car, never repaid. October 22nd, 2023, paid $80,000 for his wedding, emptied retirement savings. Each line was a memory anchored in sacrifice, and as the list grew, so did my strength. I wasn't just reminding myself of what I had done, I was reclaiming my narrative. If Daniel and Lorraine wanted to pretend I had never mattered, this record would say otherwise. This was my truth, etched in ink. It wasn't only about money, though. I began writing down the small things, too. Nights spent by his bedside when fever gripped him. The afternoons when I skipped lunch so he could have seconds. The hours I spent sewing torn uniforms, mending sneakers, cheering at games. Invisible labor, I labeled those pages. Invisible to everyone but me, until now. The more I wrote, the more I realized something. Lorraine might have her money, her estate, her pearls. But she could never erase the life I had built with Daniel from the ground up. She could never purchase those years, no matter how much wealth she flaunted. That realization sparked something dangerous: hope. Not hope for reconciliation, no. That ship had sailed, burned, and sunk the day he called another woman his mother. But hope for balance, for justice, for dignity. I started collecting more than memories. I gathered receipts, bank statements, old letters, photographs. I tucked them neatly into folders, labeling them carefully. One folder read, "Sacrifices," another, "Proof," another, "Legacy." At first, I wasn't sure why I was doing it. Perhaps it was just the habit of a teacher organizing, cataloging. But deep down, I knew. I was preparing. For what exactly, I didn't yet know, but I could feel it taking shape, like a storm forming on the horizon. Meanwhile, Daniel's visits became rarer. When he did call, it was usually perfunctory, a brief check-in before steering the conversation back to Lorraine. He spoke of her generosity, her guidance, her wisdom. It was as though her name had become a refrain, a chant, and he couldn't speak without invoking it. Lorraine thinks we should invest in real estate. Lorraine wants us to come with her to Europe this summer. Lorraine says. Each time I nodded politely, biting back the words I longed to say. And what do you think, Daniel? What does your own heart say? But it no longer mattered. He was too far gone, too blinded by the glitter of wealth and status. Emily only fueled it. She had perfected the role of dutiful wife, echoing Lorraine's opinions, amplifying her presence in their lives. I could see it clearly now. This was her strategy all along. She had married Daniel not just for love, but for opportunity, the opportunity to bind herself to Lorraine's fortune. And Daniel, my sweet, naive boy, had walked right into it. One night, I attended a small church gathering. Afterward, an old friend pulled me aside. She hesitated, then whispered, "Margaret, don't let them take everything from you. You've given enough. Protect what's yours." Her words clung to me long after I went home. Protect what's yours. That night, I sat with my notebook and stared at the words I had written. The thought came unbidden. What if I stop giving? What if I take back control? It was a dangerous thought, one I might have dismissed years ago, but now it felt liberating. For decades, I had defined myself by sacrifice. I had poured every ounce of myself into being a mother, believing it was enough. But what had it earned me? A son who erased me, a daughter-in-law who mocked me, a woman who usurped me. No, it was time to redefine myself. I began to make lists, not of past sacrifices, but of future actions. Small things at first, updating my will, redirecting my savings, speaking to a lawyer about inheritance rights. Then larger ones, how to reveal the truth. How to show the world who had truly built Daniel's life, how to reclaim my dignity without lowering myself to their cruelty. The more I planned, the stronger I felt. And for the first time since that cursed wedding night, I slept peacefully. because I knew this silence could be power, patience could be strategy. And one day, when the time was right, my silence would break and they would hear me, loud and clear. For months, I told myself that Daniel's words at the wedding had been reckless, that perhaps the champagne or the emotion of the day had loosened his tongue. But the more time passed, the more I realized it wasn't a slip at all. It was intentional, deliberate. And behind that intention, I began to see the shadow of Emily's hand. Emily had always been polite in the brittle, careful way one is with strangers. From the day Daniel introduced her, she greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. She called me by my first name, Margaret, instead of Mom, as if the word burned her tongue. I chalked it up to nerves, to the distance between us. But now I knew better. She had been building that distance on purpose. The signs were all there. I only had to piece them together. I remembered one evening before the wedding when Daniel and Emily came to dinner. I had made Daniel's favorite meal, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. As we sat around the table, Emily casually remarked, "Daniel says he's always felt more like a guest in this house than at home." Her tone was light, but her eyes flicked toward me, measuring the reaction. Daniel had blushed, muttered something dismissive, but the seed had been planted. That was her way. Small comments, innocent on the surface but corrosive underneath. Another time she had said, "You know, Daniel looks so much like Lorraine's side of the family. It's almost uncanny." She laughed, but again her eyes lingered on me, waiting for the hurt to land. And then, of course, came the constant chorus of Lorraine this, Lorraine that. Every suggestion Emily made was backed by her aunt. Every decision Daniel wavered on, Emily resolved with, "Lorraine thinks we should." It was as if she were slowly replacing my voice in Daniel's head, with her aunt's, one whisper at a time. At first I told myself I was imagining it, but the more I observed, the clearer it became. Emily wanted me gone. Not just out of Daniel's life, but out of the story altogether. One afternoon I ran into an old colleague at the market, a woman who now worked in the same building as Emily. As we caught up, she lowered her voice and said, "You know, Margaret, I overheard Emily once laughing with her co-workers about how Daniel's real mother is the one who can actually provide for them." I didn't understand it then. Now I think I do. Her words chilled me. Emily had been preparing this narrative long before the wedding. She had crafted it carefully, weaving it into Daniel's mind until it felt like his own truth. And Daniel, blinded by love and dazzled by wealth, had swallowed it whole. But it wasn't just Daniel she wanted to fool. It was everyone. At another family dinner, I caught her speaking softly to one of my cousins, praising Lorraine's generosity, hinting at how much she had supported them. "She's practically Daniel's second mother," Emily said with a laugh. "Honestly, sometimes it feels like she's his real one." The words landed like a slap, and though my cousin glanced at me with discomfort, Emily carried on as though she hadn't noticed. That night, after they left, I pulled out my notebook again. This time, I didn't write numbers or sacrifices. I wrote lies. Every manipulation, every comment, every story she had spun. I titled the section "Emily's Influence." The more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. Emily had orchestrated the distance. Lorraine had provided the wealth, but Emily had provided the poison. Together, they had built a new narrative, one where I was unnecessary, even expendable. And Daniel, my son, had chosen to believe it. The betrayal cut deeper when I realized how far it had spread. Friends I'd known for years started treating me differently, their questions laced with subtle doubt. "Daniel seems so close to Lorraine now," one said gently. "Isn't it wonderful he has so much support?" Wonderful. Support. Words that felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. I smiled politely, but inside my resolve hardened. If Emily thought she could erase me quietly, she had underestimated me. Because while she whispered in shadows, I was building my record in daylight. My notebook grew heavier, my folders thicker. I collected not just evidence of my sacrifices, but proof of her manipulation statements, overheard patterns of behavior, contradictions in her stories. I wasn't sure yet how I would use it, but I knew one thing: the day would come when I would reveal the truth. One evening, as I was sorting through old photographs, I paused at one of Daniel at 10 years old, holding up a science fair ribbon. His grin was wide, his eyes shining, and I stood behind him with my hands on his shoulders. That boy had once trusted me completely. That boy had once believed in me without question. I whispered to the photograph, "One day you'll remember. One day you'll see who really stood by you." And as the night deepened, I felt the same calm settle over me that had carried me since the wedding. This wasn't just grief anymore, it was strategy. Emily thought she had silenced me, but she had only awakened something she never expected a mother who had nothing left to lose. And I promised myself this: the day I revealed the truth, the world would know exactly who had lied, who had manipulated, and who had truly earned the right to be called mother. How do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? The day I decided to take action was surprisingly ordinary. The kind of day no one would ever remember but me. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the calendar on the wall. A red circle marked the date of Daniel's birthday, just a week away. For years I had celebrated that day with joy, baking his favorite cake, wrapping thoughtful gifts, calling relatives to make it special. But this year, as I looked at that red circle, all I felt was a hollow ache. What would I give him now? Another gift he wouldn't appreciate, another sacrifice he would hand over to Lorraine's shadow. No. That was the morning I closed my notebook, tucked it into a drawer, and pulled out a different stack of papers, the file that held my will. It had been years since I last updated it. At the time, I'd left everything to Daniel. The house, the savings, the small pension I had built. All of it. I had written it with pride, believing it was my duty as a mother to secure his future. But now, staring at the yellowing pages, I felt something shift inside me. Why should I leave my life's work to a man who had already erased me, to a woman who mocked me, to an outsider who wore pearls and stole my title as mother? The answer was simple: I shouldn't. That afternoon, I made an appointment with a lawyer. The office was quiet, lined with shelves of thick books, the air faintly smelling of ink and leather. I sat across from a young attorney who looked barely older than Daniel, and I explained calmly with a steady voice that I wanted to change everything. When he asked why, I smiled politely and said, "Circumstances change." It was the truth. Circumstances had changed. But the deeper truth, the betrayal, the humiliation I kept to myself, that was mine. We spent hours going over the details. I redirected my savings into a trust for charities. I cared about a literacy program for underprivileged children, a scholarship fund for students who reminded me of my old classroom. I adjusted the house inheritance too. Instead of Daniel, it would go to my niece who had shown me nothing but kindness. For decades, I had poured everything into my son. Now I would pour into those who actually valued me. When the documents were signed, I felt lighter than I had in months. It was as if a weight had lifted from my chest, replaced by a quiet sense of control. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since the wedding. But changing my will wasn't the only step. I began to move carefully, deliberately. Whenever Daniel and Emily came over, I listened more than I spoke. I stored away every comment, every smug remark, every lie they repeated about Lorraine's supposed support. And afterward, I wrote it all down. I wasn't just collecting memories anymore. I was building a case. In quiet moments, I even rehearsed. What would I say when the time came to confront them? How would I reveal the truth? I pictured their faces, Daniel's confusion, Emily's shock, Lorraine's mask cracking, and the thought steadied me. The turning point, however, came unexpectedly. It was at a Sunday brunch hosted by Lorraine in her sprawling estate. Against my better judgment, I went. Part of me wanted to see for myself how far the charade had gone. The house was a monument to excess. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Portraits of ancestors I didn't know lined the walls. Servants floated quietly between rooms carrying trays of champagne and pastries. Lorraine welcomed me with a smile that was more smirk than kindness. Margaret, she purred, how wonderful you could join us. Emily was radiant in a designer dress, Daniel glowing beside her. They looked like they belonged in that world, like they had been absorbed into Lorraine's orbit completely. During brunch, Lorraine raised her glass for a toast. To family, she said, her eyes sliding toward me, and to the ones who truly build us up. Everyone clinked glasses, laughter ringing out. Everyone except me. I sipped water instead, my face calm, my heart steady. Because in that moment I realized something vital. I didn't need to scream or argue or beg. I didn't need to demand recognition. My strength wasn't in forcing them to see me. It was in showing them what it meant to lose me. When brunch ended, Daniel walked me to the door. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said casually, as if he had done me a favor. I looked at him carefully. "Daniel," I said softly, "do you ever think about who really built your life?" He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" I shook my head and smiled. Never mind. But inside I knew he would remember that question. From that day forward, my silence took on a new shape. It wasn't empty. It was strategic. Every smile, every nod, every polite word I offered was a mask, a cover for the truth I was preparing to unleash. Because one day, when the time was right, they would discover what I had done. And when they did, the shock would be far greater than any applause Lorraine had ever received. The day I confronted them was not chosen at random. I waited for the perfect opportunity, a moment when Daniel and Emily would have no distractions, no audience to perform for, no Lorraine hovering in the background with her pearls and her smirk. That opportunity came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Daniel had called earlier in the week to say they wanted to stop by for a quick visit. It was the first time in months that the visit seemed spontaneous rather than orchestrated. I agreed, keeping my voice calm, though my heart beat steadily with resolve. By then, my folders were neatly organized. Every receipt, every bank statement, every loan slip, every note of sacrifice documented in ink. They were stacked in a box by the living room chair, ready. For weeks, I had rehearsed this moment in my mind, what I would say, how I would say it, how I would not let emotion overtake me. When they arrived, Emily breezed in first, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, her perfume overpowering the air. Daniel followed, his smile polite but distracted, as though he were already thinking about his next appointment. "Hi, Mom," he said casually, kissing my cheek before glancing toward the kitchen. "Do you have any of those cookies you used to make?" The words stung not because of what he asked, but because of how thoughtless they were. Here he was, the man who had called another woman his mother, asking me to feed him, as if nothing had happened. I forced a small smile. "Sit down, I have something for you." They exchanged a quick glance, Emily raising an eyebrow, Daniel shrugging, and then sat on the couch. I carried the box of folders into the room and placed it on the coffee table between us. The weight of it landed with a thud, the sound sharp in the stillness. "What's this?" Daniel asked, frowning. I opened the top folder and pulled out a receipt. My hands were steady, my voice calm. "This," I said, "is the tuition payment for your first year of college. $12,000, paid in full by me." Daniel blinked, confused. "Okay." I set it aside and pulled out another. "This is the loan I took out for your car. $6,000. You promised to repay it, but I never asked for it back." Another document. "This is the bill for your soccer camp." And this, I tapped. "The next folder is the check I wrote for your wedding. $80,000, my retirement savings, every penny I had." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Emily sat straighter, her lips tightening, her eyes darting between the papers. "Mom, what is this about?" Daniel asked, irritation creeping into his tone. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "This is about truth, Daniel. You stood in front of a room full of people, our family, our community, and you thanked another woman as your biological mother. You erased me. So today, I want you to see exactly what I've done for you, what I gave, what I sacrificed. Because Lorraine may have her money, but she did not raise you. She did not build you. I did." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Daniel's face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily jumped in first. This is unnecessary, Margaret. We appreciate what you've done, but Lorraine has been supporting us in ways you can't. She's supporting you. I cut her off, my voice sharper now. With what? Money, vacations, appearances. That isn't support. That's bribery disguised as generosity. Real support is staying up all night when he had a fever. Real support is working extra jobs so he could play soccer. Real support is spending decades of your life building a foundation he could stand on. And if you think that can be erased with pearls and property, then you're both more foolish than I thought. Emily's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. Daniel deserves more than just sentiment. Lorraine offers him a future. I turned to Daniel. And what do I offer you? Daniel? Nothing. Does my love mean nothing? Does my sacrifice mean nothing? For the first time, his eyes faltered. He looked down at the stack of papers, his jaw tight. The silence stretched between us. Finally, he whispered, Mom, I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a tremor in my chest, but forced myself to stay composed. Whether you meant to or not, you did. And here's the truth, I will not beg you for recognition. I will not fight with Lorraine for a title that is already mine, but I need you to understand something. Every luxury you enjoy now is built on my back. Every step you take into that world was paid for by me, and if you choose to forget that, then so be it. But I won't let you erase me. I gathered the papers back into the folders and closed the box. I wanted you to see this once, to understand, to know the truth. The rest is your choice. The room was silent. Emily looked furious, her nails digging into her armrest. Daniel looked torn, guilt flickering in his eyes, but smothered quickly by something else, fear maybe, or pride. They left soon after their goodbyes, curt their footsteps quick. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed in my chest. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the box on the coffee table. I had said what I needed to say. I had shown them the truth. Whether they accepted it or not was no longer my concern. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but lighter. Because I knew this was only the beginning. I had confronted them privately. The next time, if they forced my hand, it would be public. And then the world would know. When I confronted Daniel and Emily in my living room, I thought perhaps the sight of those papers, the weight of my words, might rattle them enough to awaken some part of their conscience. But as the days passed, it became clear they had walked away, not chastened, but defensive. Daniel called once, his voice stiff, rehearsed. Mom, I don't want us to fight, he said. I didn't raise you to erase me, I replied. Silence. Then a sigh. Lorraine she's been there for us. And that was that. The call ended, and I knew then they weren't going to change. If anything, Emily's influence was stronger than ever. Their pride wouldn't allow them to admit what they had done, even if guilt gnawed at the edges of their sleep. So I made a choice. If they would not see the truth privately, then they would see it publicly. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A family reunion, one of those sprawling, noisy affairs where cousins and aunts and uncles filled a rented hall with laughter, gossip, and food. It was the kind of event where news spread fast, where whispers became gospel in hours. If Daniel and Emily wanted to build their story of Lorraine as his real mother, they had chosen the wrong family to deceive. Because I knew one thing the people in that hall still remembered who had raised Daniel. They had seen it with their own eyes. I arrived early, carrying not just a casserole but my box of folders. I placed it discreetly by my chair, covered with a shawl. The reunion began in typical fashion, children running underfoot, adults clustered in circles with plates of food, the air filled with chatter. But the moment Daniel and Emily arrived, with Lorraine sweeping in behind them like royalty, the atmosphere shifted. People smiled, but it was cautious, polite. Everyone remembered the wedding. Everyone remembered what Daniel had said. I watched as Lorraine glided across the room, kissing cheeks, her pearls gleaming, her laughter ringing too loudly. Emily clung to her arm like a jewel on display, while Daniel followed, smiling but never once looking at me. For an hour, I let it play out. I listened to their conversations, noted the way Emily steered Daniel toward certain relatives, dropping hints of Lorraine's generosity. "She's been such a blessing," Emily said, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "She's really like a second mother to us. Honestly, sometimes it feels like she's his first." The words stung, but I waited. Patience had become my greatest weapon. Finally, when the room quieted for speeches, a family tradition, I rose. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't tremble. "Before we begin," I said, "I'd like to say a few words." Dozens of eyes turned to me, some sympathetic, some wary, all attentive. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Emily stiffened. Lorraine's smile froze just slightly. I reached for the box, set it on the table, and removed the shawl. Papers, folders, photographs, the record of a life lived for my son. I began simply. "Family. I've stayed quiet since the wedding. Many of you were there. Many of you heard my son thank another woman as his real mother. I want to tell you what that felt like. To sit in the front row after giving everything I had for decades and be erased with one sentence." The room was silent. No one dared move. I lifted a receipt. "This is Daniel's first tuition payment. Paid by me." I set it down. "This is the loan I took out for his car. Paid by me." Another paper. "This is the check I wrote for his wedding. $80,000. My retirement. Every penny I saved." One by one, I laid them out the table, filling with evidence. And these, I held up photographs, one of Daniel at 5 with his birthday cake, another of him at 10, holding his science fair ribbon, another of his graduation. These are the moments I raised him. Lorraine wasn't there. Emily wasn't there. I was. I turned then, not to the crowd, but to Daniel. "You are my son. Nothing changes that. But you chose to honor someone else as your mother, and you let her wealth blind you to the truth. If you want to erase me, so be it. But do not dare rewrite history." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. My sisters nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. A cousin muttered, "She's right," loud enough for others to hear. Emily's face flushed crimson. "This is inappropriate," she snapped. "Why drag private matters into the open?" I looked at her steadily. "Because you dragged them there first, Emily. At the wedding. In front of everyone. You wanted the world to believe Lorraine had replaced me. Now the world will know the truth." Lorraine rose, then her voice smooth, but edged. "Margaret, really, this bitterness doesn't suit you. Daniel was simply showing gratitude." "Gratitude," I echoed. "For what? For vacations? For money? Gratitude is what you give to someone who adds a little extra to your life. But you tried to take what was never yours." The room gasped. The mask on Lorraine's face cracked just for a moment before she quickly composed herself. I gathered the papers back into the box, my point made. "I won't fight for recognition anymore. I don't need to. Because everyone in this room knows who raised Daniel. And Daniel, deep down, whether you admit it or not, so do you." Silence fell. Daniel's face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between me, Emily, and Lorraine. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I sat down then, calm, composed, my heart beating steady. I didn't need to say more. The damage was done not to me, but to them. The whispers began almost immediately. Not about me, but about Lorraine and Emily, about Daniel's blindness, about the cruelty of that wedding speech. And as I sat quietly folding my shawl over my lap, I realized I had done it. I had reclaimed my dignity. Whether Daniel ever admitted it or not didn't matter anymore, because the truth was out. After the reunion, a strange quiet fell over my life. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence that follows a storm, when the air is clean, the sky is clear, and the earth is still trembling from what has passed. Word of what I had said traveled quickly. Cousins called me the next day, some to comfort me, some simply to gossip. A neighbor dropped by with a pie, whispering, "Good for you, Margaret. You deserved to be heard." Even at church, people I'd known for years came up to hug me, their voices soft but firm. "We're proud of you." It wasn't about pride, though. It was about truth. For months, I had carried the weight of humiliation, of erasure. Now that weight had shifted, it was Daniel, Emily, and Lorraine who bore it. They were the ones whispered about now, the ones judged for cruelty, for greed, for their attempt to rewrite history. And I felt free. Daniel didn't call me for weeks after the reunion. Emily's silence was expected, and Lorraine's absence was a relief. But Daniel's silence cut deeper, though not in the same way as before. This time, it wasn't grief. It was finality. When he finally did call, his voice was subdued. "Mom," he said quietly, "you embarrassed us." I took a long breath, steady and calm. "No, Daniel. I reminded you. I reminded everyone of the truth. If that embarrasses you, then perhaps you should ask yourself why." There was no response. Just the sound of his breathing on the other end, heavy, strained. For the first time, I wondered if he was finally beginning to see. But whether he did or not no longer mattered. I had made my choice. In the weeks that followed, I finished reorganizing my will. My savings went where they could do real good, to scholarships to children who needed what Daniel once had. My house was secured for the niece who had shown me nothing but kindness. Daniel would inherit nothing. Some might call it harsh, but to me it was balance. Because motherhood is not a contract written in blood, it is built in actions, in sacrifices, in love. And when those are denied, when they are erased, then a mother has the right to reclaim what is hers. I look at my life now with different eyes. My mornings are quiet, my evenings peaceful. I no longer sit at the table and ache for recognition. I no longer measure my worth by Daniel's words. I measure it by what I know to be true. I gave everything I had. And that cannot be erased. Sometimes I still look at the photographs, Daniel as a boy, grinning with scraped knees or clutching a ribbon or blowing out birthday candles. I smile, but it is bittersweet. That boy is gone, replaced by a man blinded by wealth and manipulation. But I will always remember him as he was mine. And if someday he remembers me, if someday he realizes what he lost, then perhaps he will come back. Not as the man who betrayed me, but as the son who once held my hand during storms. Until then, I live with peace. Because the final truth is this: I am not defined by his ingratitude. I am defined by my strength. And if Lorraine, Emily, and even Daniel himself think they won the game that night at the wedding, they are wrong. I won. I won because I spoke. I won because I refused to be erased. I won because I chose myself. And in choosing myself, I found freedom. Slow emotional fade out, 250 words. As I sit now on my porch, the evening sun casting golden light across the yard, I feel something I thought I had lost: peace. The roses sway in the breeze, their petals open wide, as though even they know the weight has lifted. I think about that night at the wedding, the applause, the humiliation, the way my heart cracked in two. And then I think about the reunion, the papers spread across the table, the moment I reclaimed my voice. Life doesn't always give us justice in the way we imagine. Sometimes it takes betrayal to reveal strength. Sometimes it takes erasure to remind us we exist. I am not the woman who sat frozen in the front row, invisible. I am the woman who stood, who spoke, who chose dignity over silence. And maybe someone out there listening to this story will see themselves in me. If you do know this, you are not powerless. You are not erased. You still hold the pen. Have you ever been in a situation where you gave everything only to be replaced, unacknowledged, erased? If you were me, would you forgive? Or would you take back your power as I did? Tell me your story, because in sharing we find strength. And if my story moved you, if you want to hear more truths like mine, then don't forget to subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because sometimes the truth is all we have left.